what actually happened to Pan Am? This company was once the world's most recognizable airline and also the de facto flag carrier of the United States. And to give you an idea of just how important this airline once was, a rumor goes that during the Cold War, diplomats from the US State Department and even CIA spies were told that if there was ever an emergency and they needed to flee the country they were in to get back to American soil, they should head not for the nearest American embassy, but instead to the nearest Pan Am office. And to understand what that was based on, we need to go back to a time when flying overseas was very different from what it is now. You see, for a very long time, flying was romantic and truly exclusive, and for most it felt like a taste of the future. And the airline that most represented this picture was undoubtedly Pan Am. It introduced aircraft that changed global travel forever, pushed manufacturers towards larger and more ambitious designs, and built an international network that was so vast that it often looked less like an airline and more like a flying manifestation of American influence abroad. So, how did such a symbolic brand and the idea of modernity that it brought with it just fade away? Well, Pan Am's collapse wasn't caused by a single bad decision or one catastrophic event. No, in many ways, the company failed because it had become almost perfectly adapted to the conditions of the aviation world of the 1950s and 60s. And when that world then disappeared, the very thing that once made Pan Am dominant slowly became its weakness instead. In the early years of aviation, flying internationally was nothing like what we know today. There were no massive global airline alliances feeding huge connection hubs, and aircraft range was limited, weather forecasting was primitive, navigation over the oceans was a work in progress, and many governments viewed aviation as something closer to a strategic national asset than a competitive business. And that was an environment that Pan Am's founder, Joan Trippe, understood better than almost anyone else. So he started trying to build a global network before anyone else could, and in the 1920s and 30s that meant acquiring access, which was far more valuable to him than planes or pilots. Like other countries at that same time, the United States increasingly viewed aviation as an extension of American commercial and geopolitical influence, and that relationship gave Pan Am advantages that were almost impossible for other competitors to replicate. Whilst domestic airlines inside of the United States fought over routes between American cities, Pan Am was building a network that stretched outward, across oceans into Latin America, Europe, and eventually the rest of the world. And because so few airlines possessed the aircraft, infrastructure, and political access needed to operate those kind of routes reliably, competition remained very limited. But that also meant that Pan Am in the beginning needed to bootstrap basically everything from the ground up. So they ended up building overseas terminals, maintenance facilities, training centers, and even seaplane bases for aircraft like the Boeing 314 Clipper, which eventually became one of the great symbols of pre-war luxury air travel. By the way, if you ever wondered why pilot uniforms look the way they do, those planes are a clue. It was actually Pan Am's CEO that had the idea of outfitting pilots so that they would look like ship crews, and that's where the uniform and the captain's 4 stripes comes from. Anyway, from the very start, Pan Am's aircraft carried diplomats, military officials, business leaders, and wealthy travelers across routes that at the time felt extraordinary to much of the public. And that actually created the foundation for Pan Am's success, since it emerged during a period when international aviation was tightly controlled, politically protected, and incredibly expensive. This all meant that Pan Am never had to think about competition the way that modern airlines do today. Instead, it focused on prestige, expansion, and becoming synonymous with international flight itself. Now, for a while, that strategy worked brilliantly. In fact, it worked so well that Pan Am would eventually help create the modern jet age altogether. You see, the Second World War changed aviation technology so quickly that by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the world suddenly found itself on the edge of a transportation revolution. Aircraft were becoming larger, faster, and more reliable, whilst long overwater flights that had once required flying boats and multiple refueling stops were suddenly beginning to look practical for even conventional land-based planes. The war had then also led to the development of many new airports where those planes could land, and nobody pushed harder to capitalize on that shift than Pan Am did. Under Johan Trippe, the airline developed a reputation for constantly forcing the aviation industry forward, often even before the technology or economics fully made sense. And to do this, Pan Am, among other things, exerted enormous pressure on aircraft manufacturers. They were, for example, the launch customer for the Boeing 707, the aircraft that truly brought jet-powered passenger travel into the mainstream at the end of the 1950s. And compared to the piston-engine aircrafts that had dominated long-haul flying before it, the 707 also completely changed the economics and psychology of international travel. Flights became dramatically faster, smoother and more reliable, while oceans that had once felt enormous suddenly started shrinking. Now, other US airlines got the 707 too, but Pan Am became inseparable from the idea of modern international travel since the company projected luxury and global reach in a way that few corporations ever have. Their blue globe logo appeared everywhere from airport terminals to Hollywood films, while Pan Am crews became part of the broader cultural image of the jet age. Flying internationally still remained expensive, but through Pan Am it now also felt aspirational and modern. But the key point here is that this system worked because the economics of aviation still heavily favored airlines like Pan Am. International routes remained tightly regulated by governments, competition was limited, and all of this meant that ticket prices could stay extremely high. Airlines were also not yet competing on efficiency or low fares, since those were also regulated, as we explained in a previous video. Instead, airlines competed on service and global reach, which happened to be exactly the environment that Pan Am had been designed for. So this wasn't a free market in any sense, and airlines like Pan Am had spent decades perfecting a business model inside of a system that was designed to prevent the kind of brutal price competition that would later define the industry. Also, a quick side note here. When you see posts that try to bait you with false nostalgia for what flying used to look like, remember that the prices back then for main cabin tickets cost around what a modern business class ticket does today, and everything smelled like smoke. In any case, in the mid-1960s, Pan Am made a decision that would come to symbolize both the absolute peak of its power and the beginning of the risks that would eventually destroy it. It demanded that Boeing should build the largest passenger aircraft that the world had ever seen, and I'll explain how that changed Pan Am's fate in just a second, but first I want to share a very different story with you, one that frankly is quite terrifying. Back in February this year, a journalist timed herself to see how fast she could find one of her colleagues' home address online. Now, she wasn't a professional hacker by any means, just a regular person, and it took her 30 seconds. She then continued by looking up the colleague's address at a real estate site and soon managed to find a floor plan complete with entry points and windows, so just imagine how easily it would have been to plan a break-in with info like that. Now, my point with telling you this story is not to scare you, but instead to bring awareness to a very real and serious issue, which is how unsafe your personal data is nowadays. But luckily, today's sponsor Incogni can help you change that. Incogni is a subscription-based service that removes your personal data from sketchy but legal websites that sells your info to the highest bidders. Once you sign in, Incogni will continuously scan the internet for your details, and when they get a match, they will contact the site and demand that your info gets taken down. They will then send you weekly info on their progress, like this one, and as you can see, they are being quite busy working on my account. Right now, you will get a 60% discount when you scan this QR code or by going to incogni.com/mentor now. Thank you Incogni for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to Pan Am and their pressure on Boeing. The aircraft that emerged from Pan Am's demand was of course the queen of the sky, the mighty Boeing 747. And at the time, it is really difficult to overstate just how shocking that airplane looked to the world. Compared to the jets that had come before it, the 747 seemed almost absurdly big. It could carry hundreds of passengers across oceans in a single flight, more than doubling the capacity of aircraft like the 707. And when Pan Am introduced it into service in 1970, it felt like another giant leap towards the future. Now, people back then were used to seeing fast advancement in aviation, and the 747 seemed like another move in that direction, even though many still hoped at that point that all long-haul flying would eventually become supersonic. But that's a different story. At first, the arrival of this big jumbo jet appeared to work perfectly. The 747 helped push international travel into the mainstream by lowering seat mile costs and allowing airlines to spread expenses across far more passengers. So, flights that had once been reserved mostly for the wealthy now slowly became accessible to ordinary middle-class travelers as well. Families could suddenly vacation overseas in numbers that would have seemed impossible only a decade earlier, and Pan Am found itself sitting directly at the center of this enormous transformation in global travel. But hidden beneath all of that success was a weakness that the airline had spent decades avoiding to address head-on simply because they hadn't needed to. You see, unlike airlines like American, United or Delta, Pan Am barely had any domestic networks inside of the United States at all, so they weren't just big on international travel, that was almost all that they did. And during the years when international aviation remained tightly regulated and enormously profitable, that didn't really seem like a problem. In many ways, it had actually helped create Pan Am's mystique. The airline was international and that was its identity. But as the airline industry now adapted and evolved, this focus soon became a liability. You see, what Pan Am actually lacked was the feeding mechanism that would later become critically important. Today, America's big three, Delta, United and American Airlines, depend on networks that allows them to funnel passengers from dozens of smaller cities into major hubs before sending them onwards internationally. A flight to London or Tokyo might ultimately depend on passengers connecting in from places all across the country in order to fill the airplanes profitably, but Pan Am had never bothered building that kind of a system. Instead, they had relied heavily on premium international demand between major global cities, and for a long time that had worked beautifully. The high ticket prices, the limited or non-existent competition, all meant that governments around the world protected international carriers from the kinds of market pressures that we take for granted today. But by the late 1970s, that environment had begun to shift. Oil shocks drove fuel prices sharply upward, and the economic instability that followed started cutting into demand for expensive travel. On top of that, with the rising fuel prices, the economics of operating giant long-haul aircraft suddenly looked far less forgiving than they had during the optimism of the 1960s. A half-full 747 still burned enormous amounts of fuel, and Pan Am had built itself around the assumption that international demand would just continue to grow basically indefinitely. Also, at almost exactly that same moment, the regulatory system that had protected airlines from intense competition was beginning to collapse. And once that happened, Pan Am would soon find that the aviation world that they had partly created and mastered was disappearing under their feet. Now, that collapse came in stages, but one of the biggest turning points arrived in 1978 with the passage of the Airline Deregulation Act. You see, before that, the federal government had tightly controlled much of the airline industry through the Civil Aeronautics Board. It was the regulator that controlled and approved routes and made sure that fares remained at the agreed levels, which was how airline competition had been actively discouraged or eliminated. But this Deregulation Act changed all of that almost overnight in 1978. Airlines now suddenly gained far more freedom to compete on routes and pricing, both domestically in the United States and beyond, and with that, plus the oil crisis that had happened years earlier, the entire logic of the industry began to shift. Prestige and glamour still mattered, but efficiency started mattering far more. So the airlines now needed ways to consistently fill their aircraft at lower fares, whilst also being able to survive increasingly aggressive competition. And that was exactly the kind of environment that favored airlines with huge domestic hub systems. Airlines like Northwest, TWA and Delta were now suddenly able to feed passengers from all across the United States into their major international gateways. And this meant that a traveler from a smaller city no longer needed to live in New York, Los Angeles or Miami in order to economically find seats on a long-haul flight, nor did they need to arrange travel from their own small town to a hub or pay a travel agent to do it for them. So prepared airlines could now aggregate passengers from dozens of markets into one giant network, creating the modern hub and spoke system that still dominates American commercial aviation today. Now, Pan Am were slow to recognize that they were in trouble here. Surely, they thought, they still possessed one of the most recognizable brands on Earth, so the lack of a domestic infrastructure might be a disadvantage, but not a decisive one, even in this new era. Initially, Pan Am also assumed that domestic airlines would recognize the value of their international network on its hubs on the east and west coast, and that these airlines would therefore continue feeding Pan Am with domestic traffic from their own networks. Now, that was how it had worked when the CAB controlled everything, but other airlines now simply didn't need to play that role anymore. Instead, it was much easier for these airlines who already had domestic networks to start flying internationally themselves, whilst Pan Am had to do the opposite. Now, it would take time for those airlines to build up their international route networks, but if they did their homework, they could then keep all seats filled up as they grew and remain profitable. But that was much more difficult for Pan Am, who had to do the same but opposite. They eventually realized the seriousness of the problem, but by the time they did, they were already way behind everyone else. In 1980, Pan Am purchased National Airlines in an attempt to quickly build a domestic network that it could use to funnel passengers into its international routes. And on paper, that idea made perfect sense. But this turned out to be a rushed move, which quickly turned into a financial and operational disaster. As with almost all such acquisitions, integration problems appeared almost immediately, and the merger was also enormously expensive, meaning that Pan Am now took on major debts in exactly the wrong moment. And even worse, many of the routes Pan Am acquired through this merger were not especially complementary to their existing system, which had been the whole point of this acquisition. And this meant that the company still struggled to create the kind of efficient domestic feed network its competitors already had. So Pan Am were now desperately trying to build in a few years what other airlines had spent decades constructing, and they had hugely underestimated the size of that challenge. By this point, the airline industry had also become truly unforgiving. Fuel prices remained volatile, competition intensified, fares kept falling, and the enormous prestige that had once defined Pan Am no longer guaranteed profitability. The company still looked glamorous from the outside, but underneath, the economics were already broken. By the late 1980s, Pan Am had basically entered a kind of slow-motion collapse. Its 747s still crossed the Atlantic every day, and the blue globe and its enormous cultural weight were still present around the world, but behind the scenes, the airline was mostly surviving by selling pieces of itself off. First came the sale of the Pacific routes to United Airlines in 1985, which would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. These routes had once been some of the crown jewels of the Pan Am system, connecting the United States to Asia across the Pacific in a way that few airlines could match. But Pan Am now desperately needed cash, and so some of the most valuable parts of the airline began disappearing, like their aircraft, terminals, and eventually even the iconic Pan Am building in New York. But still, the airline kept trying to survive through restructurings, network changes, and cost-cutting programs. But it was just too late. Airlines with stronger domestic systems could now spread costs across far larger passenger networks, while Pan Am remained dependent on its volatile international traffic and costly long-haul operations. Then, in December of 1988, came the horrific bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, and some have argued that this event single-handedly destroyed Pan Am, but like you now know, the airline had been in a financial dead end long before this happened. But this accident definitely accelerated that decline, and the press coverage that followed now fully exposed the airline's problems to the world. That severely damaged the public confidence in the airline, It generated enormous legal and financial pressure and tied Pan Am's name forever to one of the most deadly terrorist attacks of the Cold War era. And unfortunately for Pan Am, there was even more to come. As the airline and the rest of the industry entered the early 1990s, along came the first Gulf War, which meant that once again, everyone had to deal with rising fuel prices, weakening international demand, and a competitive environment that by then had become truly ruthless. By this point, carriers like Delta and United had refined the hub-and-spoke model into the powerful regional, domestic and international networks that has now become the norm, while Pan Am still struggled under fragmentation, years of failed restructuring attempts and enormous debt. In a last-ditch effort to stay alive, Pan Am sold most of their prized Atlantic routes to Delta Airlines in 1991, and for decades those routes had been the very heart of the airline's identity, along with those over the Pacific. So selling them was a clear admission that the company was now running out of options. Delta Airlines then actually invested directly into Pan Am and briefly attempted to keep the airline alive while management searched desperately for a long-term rescue. And at one stage, there were even discussions about selling the entire remaining operation to Delta. But by that point, Pan Am's finances had deteriorated too far and the public confidence in it had collapsed. So on December 4th, 1991, Pan American World Airways ceased operation. After more than 6 decades, the airline that had once defined international air travel disappeared almost overnight, with many of its remaining assets eventually being absorbed by other carriers. And that marked the almost surreal ending to an airline that had spent most of its life looking like the future. Now, I hope you liked this deep dive into one of the most iconic names in aviation. And is there any other airline out there that you would like us to tell you more about? Let me know in the comments here below, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss anything. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.